Hello! Today we are going to discuss some common issues of parchment objects using the Alabama state constitutions as a case study. These objects were treated by NEDCC in 2018 in preparation for the state's bicentennial in 2019. First and foremost, we need to determine what are the Alabama state constitutions. When I ask this, I'm asking what the object physically is, what it is comprised of, and how these various parts have been affected over time. All conservation treatment begins with an examination of the object. This gives us a chance to get a sense of the piece and note problematic areas. Now you can imagine it would be quite difficult to look at oversized materials all at once. There's very few places that actually have the space to do so, and things can easily be missed if it's not done properly. So we tend to take larger objects, such as the Alabama constitutions, in sections and make notes as we go. This provides us with a general impression of what the object is and what might have happened to it. We can then get a closer look by lifting or testing areas with spatulas, taking note of things that are still intact and how the various pieces interact with one another, and generally assessing problem areas that are damaged or at risk of further damage if they aren't treated. Once we fully examine the objects, we can organize our thoughts and assess problems. In the case of the Alabama constitutions, the most obvious thing was that most of them were in a rolled format and quite long, between 20 and 45 feet in length. The exceptions were the Ordinance of Secession, which was a single sheet, the 1865 Constitution, which was a set of ledger pages sewn together at the upper edge, and the 1901 Constitution, which was a bound volume. The second aspect that was immediately noticeable was how the sheets were attached together, either with ribbons or using a protein-based adhesive. It was also noted that the adhesive on many of the seams were failing and some of the ribbons were fraying. In these two pictures, you can see why the seam failures would make handling these constitutions difficult. In the photo on the left, the fact that the seams were no longer adhered together meant that there was a lot of strain being placed on the central security ribbon unless the edges were weighed down. From a historical context, it also meant that the document was not working in the way its creators intended. All of this together prevented the document from being safely accessed by researchers and the public. Even trained archive staff needed to take care when pulling the object out for any reason. In the photo on the right, we had ribbons that were loose or hung off the sides. This caused two complications. The first was that it did not control the movement of the sheets as it should, and this caused more abrasion to the ribbons than necessary every time it was unrolled. The second complication was that the ribbons easily became entangled or damaged on the sides every time it was handled, which led to some parts of the ribbon being lost. It was also noted that a vast majority of the sheets were good quality parchment, and the parchment was generally consistent throughout each object. This consistency becomes important once you understand the nature of parchment. You see, parchment is actually an animal skin and not a plant-based material. This makes it very different from paper, and because of those differences, conservators are limited in the types of treatments we can perform on parchment-based objects. The parchment making process is very labor intensive and requires a lot of patience to create a good skin. In the final stages, the skin is placed on a frame, as seen in the photo on the left, and then thinned with a lunar blade, as seen in the photo on the right. This process can take several days or weeks to complete. During this time, the parchment maker has to ensure that the skin is even overall by checking the tension and making sure that their strokes are smooth to prevent irregularities. The tensioning is highly important as different parts of the skin react differently to the environment, and so it stops the skin from shrinking or stretching irregularly as it dries for the first time. Once off the tensioning, each skin will move as the humidity and temperature of the environment changes, much like your own skin does to changes in weather. The difference is, while parchment has a memory of how it used to react, it doesn't have the underlying structure to help it return to its original form. Because of this memory, the leg joints tend to move more, while the spine stays rigid. Usually, parchment sheets are cut down to minimize the amount of shoulder pieces or axilla to keep the document flat. But for most of the Alabama constitutions, all parts of the skin were used. This would affect treatment, along with the fact that multiple sheets meant that multiple animals that had lived different lives and therefore had a different skin memory of how they would react. The last important thing that the examination told us was that iron gall ink was used on a majority of the constitutions. While there were other inks present, iron gall ink is notoriously problematic, and it does tend to break more easily on parchment than paper. This is a common type of damage for parchment objects, and the ink composition and application can cause more flaking. To understand why this is more common for parchment, we need to look at iron gall ink and how it reacts on paper first. Iron gall ink has four main components: tannic acid, iron sulfate, wine, and gum arabic. Historically, there was no standardized recipe in terms of the amount of each ingredient added. Like a cook in the kitchen, everyone had their preferences for how they made their ink. This usually led to the ink being unstable by either being more acidic or not having enough gum arabic to hold it together once it dried. The level of instability of the ink was usually not visible for many years after the document was complete. When we apply ink to paper, it tends to sink into the paper due to the pores. Once dried, as the paper experiences increases in humidity and temperature, the paper expands and the ink moves with it. As temperature and humidity decrease, the paper contracts and the ink follows. This is because the ink is embedded within the paper matrix. This is not always the case with parchment. Rather than sinking in, the ink sits on its surface, and then, as the parchment experiences changes in humidity and temperature, small fractures begin to appear in the ink as it strains to keep up with the changes, until you have pieces of ink lost or fractured overall. This happens partially because the ink is resting on the surface, and partially because parchment can expand so much more than paper in a humid environment. After we understood these key features and overall damage to the constitutions, it was time to begin talking in earnest with the archive staff. This conversation covered more about the history of the constitutions, their goals for treatment, intended use, and overall preservation now and in the future. Out of this conversation, we were able to create a treatment plan that stabilized the objects and prepared them for exhibition by addressing the condition issues just covered. The full details of treatment for these constitutions is available for review on our NADCC Stories page if you want to learn more. Thank you for your time and attention. This video was written and narrated by Katie Boodle, Senior Conservator, with editing assistance from Rin Marchese, Marketing and Social Media Coordinator. Many thanks to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for allowing their work to be featured in this video. Please reach out to NADCC by phone, email, or visiting our website if you have any questions or want more information on conservation.